Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our TASO event on using institutional data to identify quality gaps and evaluate interventions. While you all sort of drift in to enter the webinar, I'll run through a few of our housekeeping points. You're all automatically muted and your videos are off. During the panel sessions throughout this session, please enter your questions using the Q&A function. We are recording this session and we will distribute the recording afterwards. We will also be after your feedback, so please keep an eye out for post-event survey in your inboxes. And we have enabled closed captioning for those who wish to use it during the event. So to access the closed captions, please select the captions icon in the toolbar below the video. So the number joining seems to have slowed down considerably, so I will begin this webinar by introducing our speaker today, Luke. Luke joined us from the Book Trust to become a research officer at TASO around 18 months ago. He created the TASO Data Visualization Style Guide, which has set the blueprint for our subsequent technical guidance online, which includes the data infrastructure guide that he's going to talk about today. So I'm going to hand you across to Luke.
Hi everyone, good to see so many people joining. This is a little overview of the session today. So as Rob said, I'm mainly going to be talking you through our data infrastructure guide, give you a bit of an introduction and background, talk a little bit about different sections we have in that guide, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So put your questions in as we go or at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to a few of those. So to get us started, I want to give a bit of context and background for anyone who's not familiar with the Data Infrastructure Guide or the wider Institutional Data Use project. So one of the projects that TASO ran last year was our Institutional Data Use project. And from this project, TASO and our project partners, we produced a whole suite of resources and reports. And today I'm going to be focusing in on one of those and introducing you to our Data Infrastructure Guide. We're really excited about our Data Infrastructure Guide, and we think it's going to make a really valuable addition to our suite of resources to support the sector with evaluation. So I'm looking forward to talking to you a bit about it today. Before I get stuck into what's in the Data Infrastructure Guide and the context of the Institutional Data Use project, I wanted to set the scene here with a quote from Hal Varian, the chief economist at Google, who a few years ago said that the ability to understand data, and in particular to be able to extract value from it, was going to be hugely important in the upcoming years. And when I came across this quote, I thought this tied nicely into what we're trying to do with our Data Infrastructure Guide and our Institutional Data Use project. So we know that lots of rich and valuable data exists out there already in universities and colleges, but that often this data is siloed, or where the data is available, it can be difficult to know how to extract the most value from that data possible. And in particular, it can be difficult to know how you can use that rich set of data to effectively identify quality gaps and use this data for evaluation. This speaks to what we found from previous TASO projects. So the need for the Institutional Data Use project and the Data Infrastructure Guide came about as a result of previous TASO work. So we'd found in the last couple of years that, as I said, data collected by universities and colleges is rich and really varied, but that our evaluations were often limited in scope because there was insufficient data available. So sometimes that's because the data doesn't exist, or often it's because it's difficult to access or to use for evaluation purposes. So in our report on teaching and learning in the time of COVID, we saw that the disruption from COVID and the move online may have disproportionately impacted students from disadvantaged groups, which was a really valuable insight. But we were unfortunately unable to make any causal inference producing that type 3 evidence because there was insufficient historical data in order for us to be able to identify a suitable comparison group. And then in our learning analytics project, we looked to determine the impact of a phone call service to disadvantaged students compared to just an email alone. While we found that there wasn't any impact on academic engagement for students who received the call rather than an email, we were a bit limited because while we had this academic engagement data, there wasn't any data available on whether or not the students took up the support that was offered to them. And this student support data, which we couldn't access, would have helped give us really useful additional context to the evaluation. So what we found across these evaluations, as well as others, was that in many cases, data that might give us some really valuable information or useful context from intervention is either not collected or worse, collected but not available. But we knew that there's a wealth of opportunity here with using that institutional data if we can start to overcome some of the barriers that we were facing. So to help identify those barriers effectively, those barriers to using institutional data for evaluation, we started our institutional data use project, of which the data infrastructure guide is one key part. So to give you a bit more background on the wider institutional data use project, this involved working with HEPS and an evaluator to think about how we can use institutional data to support better evaluation of the student experience. And additionally, to explore opportunities for evaluation that would deliver type 2 correlational, or ideally type 3 or causal evidence. So a lot of you will be familiar with these OFS standards of evidence. We were hoping that this project would help to deliver both robust evaluations that would try to establish the causal effect of interventions, produce some of that type 3 evidence with the 4 universities that we worked with. But also we wanted to support the sector through this project to be able to produce that type 3 evidence themselves using institutional data and drawing on the lessons from these evaluations. So to do this, we worked with an evaluation team from the University of Staffordshire, and we worked with 4 higher education providers, so the University of East Anglia, the University of Huddersfield, Lancaster University, and Nottingham Trent University. And with the evaluator, we worked with all 4 of these providers to evaluate their post-entry interventions using institutional data. So we were conducting these impact evaluations, and alongside this, we also used the project as an opportunity to produce some really useful practical guidance for the sector. And so a big part of this project, learning from our work with the universities and the evaluator, as well as from previous projects, was to write this guide on using institutional data to identify quality gaps in student success and to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions designed to reduce those equality gaps. So just to say again, the aim of the data infrastructure guide specifically is to enable providers to use that institutional data to both identify quality gaps in higher education and to help providers generate robust, ideally type 3 causal evidence of the success of interventions, and to do both these things using institutional data. So we wanted this guide to be two things in particular. So firstly, we wanted it to be practical. Everything that's in this guide is designed to be as practical as possible, really, so that you can go away and apply the insights from the guide in your own institution. And it's also designed to be interactive. So we built the data infrastructure guide as its own sort of mini website rather than sort of a static PDF. So hopefully it's a really engaging resource, and it contains lots of interactive features, and we can make continual updates to it over time as well as we learn more. So we see the data infrastructure guide as a really iterative resource. Now, as part of this work to try and produce a data infrastructure guide, we ran a series of workshops that informed our writing. This included workshops on things like data availability, data infrastructure sustainability, and the ethics of using institutional data through these workshops with our project partners. So what this means, hopefully, is that the guide doesn't come from some abstract sense of what good data infrastructure looks like. It's actually going to come from conducting real impact evaluations using institutional data and working in partnership with the universities who are our project partners on this to figure out what, in the real world, the biggest barriers and facilitators are to using that institutional data effectively for evaluation. So I think at this point it's probably fair to ask precisely what we mean by institutional data. So through this collaborative process I've just discussed, we defined it as data that's recorded and used as part of an institution's administration and operations process. So this includes data about student demographics, student interaction with institutional systems through things like attendance, attainment, and course information. So it's this data that's being recorded anyway and used as part of an institution's processes. Now, the guide is aimed at different audiences in different parts. For each section, it's quite a large document. You'll see these icons indicating who we think it would be most useful for. But that said, this is written to be widely accessible. So if you see a section that says evaluators at the top and you're not one, that doesn't mean that we don't think it will be useful for you or that you won't understand it. Just that we think it might be most useful for evaluators. And overall, we think the guide should be useful for anyone from evaluators, practitioners, those responsible for writing their institution's APPs, planning teams, and senior executives and management who have responsibility for supporting student success. Which is to say that generally we think that this should be really useful for anyone who's interested in evaluating interventions. So whether that's senior executives or those delivering the intervention on the ground or anything else in between. We think this guide should be really useful for everyone. Now, anyone from a small and specialist provider, when we're talking about audiences, might be wondering if this guide is useful for them. And the short answer is yes. We know that there's huge variation in the size of universities, from small and specialist providers with less than 100 students through to huge providers with tens of thousands of students. But where possible, we've tried to make this guide as useful as possible for a wide range of providers. And we spoke to small and specialist providers as part of the development process as well. Now, the guide is organized around the 4 stages of TASO's monitoring and evaluation framework. Our monitoring and evaluation framework, or the MEF as we call it for short, because monitoring and evaluation framework is a bit of a mouthful. The MEF is a 4-step process that promotes an impact-driven approach to help you determine which interventions work in improving student outcomes. So this goes from establishing your theory of change in step one and thinking about what the problem is through to reporting your findings in step four. And this is an iterative process, hence it being a cycle and not a straight line. So your findings in each step will help to support continuous improvement. So again, because we've built the guide around the MEF, in each section of the guide, you'll see which section of the MEF that bit of the guide relates to. And the idea here is, again, that by building the guide around the MEF, this should speak to the fact that the guide is about helping you practically use institutional data in order to produce that type 3 evidence of the success of interventions. So again, we're really hoping that it's going to be really practical guidance rather than an abstract idea of what good data infrastructure should be. So that's all of the setup for the guide and how it came about, why we've written it the way we have. So now I want to talk you through some of the key features of the guide. This isn't exhaustive. We wouldn't have time to cover everything that's in the guide in this talk. As I said, it's fairly comprehensive. But the hope is in these sections here, we're going to give you a bit of a taste of what's in the guide and an understanding of our motivation. And then you can go away and use it in your own settings. So following the MEF, we use Diagnose as our first stage of the monitoring and evaluation framework. That's the first bit of our guide as well. So this bit of the guide looks at how you can diagnose the problem, how you can identify quality gaps using institutional data. Now, we know that the degree to which that you're going to be able to identify and understand quality gaps for your institution is going to depend on the data that you have available. So to think this through a bit more, we set out two broad classes of data in the guide to help add some context. So we've got the learner's context, which is data about the learner when they begin and progress through higher education, things like demographics, prior attainment, engagement with their course and institution. So data that gives you context about the learner themselves. And our other broad class of data is institution context. So data about the institution that's relevant to the learner's studies, such as the course and modules that they're studying, contact hours, type of contact, types of assessment, and timetable information. So with these different contexts of data in mind, we introduce a table to understand the different levels of institutional data as well, where each additional level provides increasing context for both the learner and the institution. Now, we've defined these levels as foundation, intermediate, and advanced. We're not leaning too much into the hierarchy here. It's likely that institutions will have data from more than one of these levels. For example, you might have some of the advanced level data while not having some of the foundational data. But thinking about these levels, the idea is to give a bit more of an idea of the kind of data that's going to give really useful context for identifying the quality gaps and in understanding what's required to target an intervention to reduce those gaps. So at the foundational level, we're really thinking about those kinds of data that are going to be really important at the core of any process to have in place for evaluation. So things like demographic data, attainment, continuation, what course they're on. At the intermediate level, we're going to be incorporating more things like engagement data, attendance data, module marks, how much they're using the virtual learning environment. And then when we get to that advanced level, we'll be able to use things like engagement with extracurricular activities, engagement with support services. So as I say, we're not leaning into the hierarchy of this table too much, but this should give you an idea that sort of as we're moving up through the levels, we're getting an increasing amount of useful context for understanding what's going on and for motivating our interventions. So after considering the various levels and contexts of institutional data, the kind of data that is useful to have, in the guide, we also cover the statistical techniques that can be used to identify these gaps in the student experience once you've got that data in place. So we've worked examples from an Open University dataset. So using real data that you can access and play around with yourselves. We discuss how you can use descriptive statistics, which everyone will be familiar with, but also how you can use inferential statistics, which some of you might be less familiar with. So this includes things like t-tests, ANOVA, regression, and we talk through how you can progress from descriptive statistics through to regression analysis and what these different kinds of analysis can tell you about equality gaps. So for example, we highlight that descriptive statistics give you a really valuable foundational understanding of the data. So that's what we see on the left here, a standard box plot of scores. And we also talk about how regression, which we see charted on the right, is going to help you to quantify the effect of various factors on student outcomes and explore in more detail the relationship between those different factors. So as part of the guide, we walk you through all of these different methods, including some stuff on interpretation, like how to interpret the output from a t-test or interpreting the output from a regression. So that was a bit of insight into what the diagnose section of our guide is like. There are other bits that I don't have time to cover here, like how you incorporate a theory of change. But moving on to the next bit of the guides and our monitoring and evaluation framework is the plan part of our MEF. So in particular here, I'm going to focus in on choosing the appropriate research methods once you've figured out the kind of data that you have and the questions you're trying to answer. So we know that when it comes to choosing an evaluation design, it can be really difficult to know where to start, particularly when we're thinking about how to get type 3 evidence, that causal evidence where we show that an intervention causes a change in outcomes. To get this type 3 evidence, this usually involves using either randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental designs. Now, quasi-experimental designs or QEDs might be a bit less familiar to people, but these basically use clever statistical methods to mimic randomization. So where randomization isn't possible, QEDs are another way of getting this type 3 evidence. But there's quite a big jump from understanding what these methods are and knowing which method is right for you in your setting and scenario. There's a bit of an art to this, and there's lots of factors that go into a decision about methods, including things like the nature of the intervention, the availability of the data, and any ethical considerations. So what we've tried to do in this part of the guide is to sort of bridge this gap and help you to understand whether RCTs or QEDs or another method entirely might be more appropriate given your circumstances, particularly thinking about the kind of data that you have on your institution. So drawing on TASO guidance and the Magenta book, which is Central Government's Guide to Evaluation, we designed a flowchart to help you consider which methods would be most appropriate and feasible for your evaluation. So obviously I can't fit the whole flowchart on screen, but I know this isn't readable here. So just to zoom into this first section and give you a sense of what the flowchart is like. So here you can see the start of the flowchart. Again, this follows our monitoring and evaluation framework, and that our first key step is always to think about whether you've used a theory of change. And you'll see that we move on to these sorts of questions around the nature of your intervention and the kind of question that you want to answer that are going to help you think through this flowchart process, think through whether RCTs or QEDs are feasible for you. So I think the best way to sort of walk you through what we're trying to achieve in this flowchart is a worked example of what going through this flowchart looks like. So I'm going to use a hypothetical example where my university is making a change to the assessment policy of some modules. So let's say we have a bunch of modules that were quite exam heavy. Some of these modules are going to move away from using exams, and some are going to stay using those exams. So what I want to do is produce type 3 causal evidence that that this change improves outcomes for various disadvantaged groups. But I'm not sure at this point which method to use. I might have an idea around using RCTs or QEDs, but I want to use this flowchart to help me zone in on which methods are going to be the most appropriate and the most feasible. So, of course, our first critical question that we kick off the flowchart with is whether you've used a theory of change to support and inform your research questions. Now, as this is the first part of our monitoring and evaluation framework, if you answer no at this part of the flowchart, you'll arrive promptly at a box that says your research questions should be informed by your theory of change. But for our worked example, I'm going to assume that yes, I do have a theory of change for my assessment policy change. So the next question I'm going to come to will prompt me to think about whether I want to know if my intervention caused any changes in outcomes. Because if this isn't what I want to know, then RCTs and QEDs might actually not be what I'm looking for. And implementation and process evaluations or value for money may actually be more appropriate methods. But in my case, my intervention, I know that I am wanting to produce causal evidence. So I'm going to move on to the next stage. At the next bit of the flowchart, we've got two questions to consider together here around the nature of the intervention. So is the intervention clearly defined and consistent over time? In my case, I know that yes, it is. And I am also expecting it to lead to direct change in outcomes. I'm hoping it'll have a direct impact on students' marks at the end of the year. So I'll progress through to the next stage, but it's worth noting that if you can't answer yes to either of these questions, that doesn't mean that you can't use experimental and quasi-experimental methods, but it might prompt you to think about how feasible they are. And this is one of the points in the flowchart where we might prompt you to think about whether theory-based evaluations or small n evaluations are more appropriate, and will signpost you to some of those resources. But in my example, my answer suggests that QEDs and RCTs are more feasible. So I'm going to move on to the next bit, where we have a bundle of questions this time, focusing on the availability of data. Now, the more that we can answer yes to these questions, again, the more feasible that QEDs or RCTs will be. So these are questions like, is outcome data available for both participants and non-participants of the intervention? Will pre-intervention outcome data be collected? Will the same outcome data be collected during and after the intervention? Can you gather a sufficiently large sample size? And do you have demographic and contextual data? So all of these questions around data availability, which you'll be also prompted to think about as part of the rest of the guide, these questions are going to inform how feasible QEDs and RCTs are. So for my example, I'm going to say that yes, most of these questions I do have good data availability. And this is going to take you to a question that prompts you to think about whether participants can be randomly allocated. If they can, then you'll be asked to think about whether this can be done ethically, in which case you'll arrive at questions about different kinds of RCTs. But in my case, I know my intervention isn't being randomly assigned, so I'm going to have to say no, participants can't be randomly allocated. And that's going to get me to this final section of the flowchart with the main QEDs that you have at your disposal and some more questions to help you decide which is most appropriate. So I know that for my intervention, after going through all of these questions, the difference in differences approach is the most appropriate method for me. And this is because I have data on both those who do and don't take part in the intervention, both before and after they took part of it. At this point, you may have arrived at a method and not be super familiar with it. You might not have heard of regression discontinuity design before or synthetic control. And you might be thinking, where do I even start with this? Well, fear not, because after the end of the flowchart, we've also included a lot more help for understanding the method that you've landed on based on your data availability. So you'll be able to see an explanation for what the method is. So in this case, I've got the difference in difference example on screen. So you're going to get a bit of a walkthrough for how the method works, how it still helps you to establish a comparator group and establish causality, get into that, how it gets you to that type 3 standard of evidence. And you'll also see a higher education example of where the method might be appropriate alongside a diagram to help you visualize what the method is doing. And you'll also get some key considerations for each method to help you think about whether it's the right method for you and identify some key things to keep in mind if you move forward with this evaluation method. So if you want to, you can go even further into impact evaluation methodologies in our measure section, the next stage of the MEF. So this section is mainly targeted at evaluators, but may be of interest if you're interested in the detail behind our impact evaluations. So in this section, we link to TASO impact evaluations using the discussed experimental and quasi-experiments designs. And among these are our impact evaluations from the institutional data use project, such as the impact evaluation for the Black Leadership Programme at Nottingham Trent University, and the peer assisted learning programme at the University of East Anglia. So just to show you what one of these looks like in the section, here's the summary of one of our impact evaluations done by the evaluation team at the University of Staffordshire for our institutional data use project. So this is the evaluation of the Black Leadership Programme at NTU. And you can see that the evaluator used institutional data in order to do propensity score matching. So they used institutional data like Polar 4 quintile, UCAS entry points, academic school as their matching variables. And they also used institutional data like academic and social engagement as the outcome measure as well. So the last bit of the data infrastructure guide that I'm going to go through today is on the barriers and facilitators of effective evaluation. So this is actually in addition to those stages from our MEF. I think it's worth restating at this point that this has been some of the highlights of the guide, not a full walkthrough. So if you think there's been anything missing, it'll be worth checking the guide, because chances are it's probably been covered. I think it's quite a comprehensive document. So the closing section of our guide is on the barriers and facilitators of effective evaluation, drawing all the work we did on the project with our project partners. So here we identify some of the key barriers to effective evaluation, and the effect that these issues have and how we might mitigate these barriers. So effectively, these are issues that are going to hinder your ability to gather, interpret, and utilize data effectively. And these issues are going to contribute to difficulties in maintaining consistent and accurate evaluation practices. When I'm going through this table, you can keep an eye out for these icons, which indicate the category of barrier that we think each barrier falls into. These categories include ethical, organizational, and barriers that relate to data infrastructure. So, for example, falling under the data infrastructure category, we highlight that it's a barrier to effective evaluation if there isn't a consistent understanding of what data means. So if commuter student is defined differently across the institution, this is going to cause problems when you try and use data on commuter students as part of any analysis. And our suggested mitigating approach here is to try using a data dictionary. We also highlight the difficulties of having a fragmented data infrastructure. So where you have to export data from multiple different systems, as well as this being a bit of a headache to try and source all of these different bits of data. You also have to manually join multiple data sets from different places. And this is going to increase the chance of errors. So here we talk about as a mitigation, sort of centralizing that access to data. So you don't have to go to multiple different places. And then one more barrier is that we look at how important it is to have clear definitions for your data over time. So where data changes over time, this can cause some difficulties with longitudinal comparisons. So when you do change your definitions, think about how that's going to affect the data over time. Now, in addition to the barriers to effective evaluation, we also include some of the facilitators, some of the best practices that can support you to overcome the challenges. So it's sort of the other side of the coin to the barriers. So to facilitate more effective evaluation, we recommend centralizing access to data, sort of the flip side of our point about fragmented data infrastructure. Some of the other facilitators we highlight include increasing the shared understanding of what data means through a data dictionary, and having a dedicated ethics process for the analysis of institutional data, particularly for using it for your APPs. Now, this barriers and facilitators bit of the data infrastructure guide ties quite closely to our project report for the institutional data use project. So in this, we draw on our findings from the project, looking at the impact evaluations, and provide some practical steps for providers to take to facilitate the analysis of institutional data, in the form of some recommendations, including some of these key points that you'll come across in the data infrastructure guide. And these recommendations include centralizing access to institutional data, and ensuring that staff, senior staff in particular, have a good understanding of evaluation, so that they can input into decisions around the kind of data infrastructure that's needed in order to be able to enable effective evaluation. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through our data infrastructure guide. As you'll remember from the start, this is just one of a series of resources to come out of the overarching institutional data use project. So you can find all of the other outputs from our institutional data use project on our website. So in addition to our data infrastructure guide, you'll also find our practical report on steps that you can take to facilitate analysis of institutional data, as we touched on briefly in those previous slides. We've also got the post-entry moat. So the moat stands for Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool, a practical resource designed to enable you to label and record outcomes and activities you deliver. So this in addition to our pre-existing pre-entry moat and attainment raising moat, to help you plan and evaluate the activities designed to support student success. And finally, if you thought we were done there, we're not. This has been a behemoth of a project, really. So additionally, you can also find all of the impact evaluations that were conducted by the University of Staffordshire, which looks to tell us what works with regards to the interventions being run by the universities involved. And alongside these impact evaluations, we've also got the implementation and process evaluations and our enhanced theory of change, which tell us why and how these interventions do or don't work. So these are really important bits of work that complement the impact evaluations. You can find all of these resources here. I'll leave it on screen for just a second, but you can also find it by navigating our website or Googling TASO institutional data use resources. Yeah, so you can follow this address, or it should be easy to navigate to on our shiny new website. Now, just before I go to Q&A, I wanted to briefly acknowledge everyone who's contributed to the project. As I said, this has been a behemoth of a project, really, and we've had really useful input from a huge number of people over the course of the project. This includes everyone from our project partners we spent many hours with to those who just attended the workshop or shared a thought. Input from all of these voices in the HE sector has helped to really shape our guide into something that I think will be a really useful and practical resource. So there they are. The list in full is at the end of our data infrastructure guide as well. So thank you to all of those people for their help on this bit of work. One thought I just wanted to close with before we go into Q&A. At the start, we had our quote from Hal Varian, the chief economist at Google, on how important extracting value from data would be. And I just want to emphasize again that we know that there's hugely rich and varied data out there at institutions, particularly collected through learning analytics systems as well now in recent years. And this data has enormous potential for research and evaluation, for generating that evidence for how we can really reduce those equality gaps. So it's absolutely vital to develop and harness your institutional data, make the most of it, and this will be a huge help and allow you to tap into a wealth of opportunities in order to be able to effectively evaluate student success. And on that note, I will open us up to some Q&A. I've been seeing some questions coming in as I've been talking, but please do keep adding questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Luke, for your whistle-stop tour of the data infrastructure guide. As Luke said, please keep your questions coming in. We'll answer them shortly. Before we do answer those questions, just like to say that we will be after your feedback for this event, so please keep an eye out for a post-event survey in your inboxes. And also, if you could look out for our other upcoming events. We've got a new sort of invitation to tender event for student success projects, and there will be that opens next week. and there will be a webinar on the 11th of February giving you more information. We've got student mental health in 2024 reports and how the situation is changing for LGBTQ plus students on the 20th of February, and heads up for our TASO annual conference, 29th to the 30th of April. All the event information can be found on our website or in the email along with our recording. Right, so let's go on to the questions. So we've got a question here from Sally Brown. Is there a plan to do a project with institutions using quasi-experimental designs, looking specifically at the ethnicity degree awarding gap?
So I'm not sure about the ethnicity degree awarding gap specifically. We do have a project that's ongoing at the moment that's trying to utilize quasi-experiments designs. So this is a project with Ipsos as the evaluator and 3 higher education providers. That's sort of in development at the moment. Hopefully there'll be some research protocols that will be published for that over the next few months. So that should give, we're hoping that'll give some really useful value for the sector on where quasi-experiments designs can be used. I don't think the interventions are looking at the ethnicity degree awarding gap specifically as part of that project. But that said, I think if you're looking to evaluate stuff to do with the ethnicity degree awarding gap, I think they'll be a really valuable addition on top of all of our previously existing work on the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So we had a project on, of course, the enhanced theories of change that were developed before. So I think between those projects and these upcoming ones that use QEDs, I think there'll be space in there for people to figure out where the opportunities are to use QEDs for evaluating the ethnicity degree awarding gap, because these methods are ultimately really really versatile. Not every method works for every research question, but often there'll be a method that you'll be able to make work to evaluate your question of interest. So if that is generating that type 3 evidence around the ethnicity degree awarding gap, hopefully this QEDs project will give you a sense of how you can apply those methods to places where you have previously found it difficult to produce type 3 evidence. So the short answer to that was no, we're not using QEDs for the ethnicity degree awarding gap at the moment, but we are doing a QEDs project that should support applying those methods in other places.
Thanks, Luke. I should also add that we did run a differences approach on curriculum reform for the ethnicity degree awarding gap, and you can find the report for that project on our website. Also, with the upcoming invitations to tender for new grants, that's on student success and projects, and this is for generating causal evidence in student success. So ethnicity degree, any project aimed at addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap would be, you'd be welcome to submit that. So I have a question here from Aliki Tennant. Does the guide cover examples of using institutional data use where the data sets are very small? As a small and specialist institution, our data sets are always small and we cannot run RCTs.
Yeah, so I think the approach that we took was that we know that it is going to be really different at the end of the day, the data that smaller specialist providers have compared to the larger ones. But what we tried to do was make the principles generally applicable, I suppose, across institutions. So I think no matter the size of data you have available. I think the guidance hopefully sets out some solid steps that anyone could take to get to a better place with the data that they do have. I think we don't use specifically examples with small and specialist institutions, but we've tried to signpost as part of the guidance where other methods might be more appropriate for small and specialist institutions. So while we focus on randomized trials and quasi-experimental designs as part of that choosing method section, we do also signpost to TASO's resources for other kinds of evaluation that might be more appropriate if you have really small numbers and a really small amount of data. I think some of the guide is inevitably going to be more appropriate for larger providers, but that said, we've tried to make it as applicable as we can to all providers, and that included inviting small and specialist providers to our workshops that we use to help generate the guide. So again, the short answer is, I suppose the examples that we work through are mainly with the large universities, because all 4 of the universities on the project that worked with us were larger. But that said, we've tried to make everything as widely accessible and appropriate as we can, given that constraint.
Thanks, Luke. It also worthwhile saying that you can build up your data sets over many years, potentially to increase the sample size. But yes, at small providers, you're probably looking more at descriptive statistics and associating those more with theory-based evaluations in order to get the best causal evidence from your data. Okay. We've got a question here from Kirsty Ross. Can you explore differences in difference with historical data sets?
Yeah, you can. So the guide should give you a bit of context in those sections on the kind of data that you need in order to be able to do a difference in difference or differences. Historical data, what you need really ideally is at least two periods historically of the measure that you're interested in. So let's try and think of the clearest way to explain this. Basically, there's a few different ways you can get to the historical data that you need for difference and differences. And the beauty of differences and differences is that it does work for historical data. So you can effectively use this method to be able to evaluate an intervention that's already happened and use that historical data. That said, if possible, it's still always going to be advantageous to sort of build the evaluation into the planning of an intervention. But if you do have an intervention that's already happened and you've got historical data on it, then there might be an opportunity to use differences there, even if you haven't planned to do an evaluation. What you're ultimately looking for to use the differences is creating a comparator group of people who have very similar trends in outcomes, but one group received the intervention and one didn't. So yeah, historical data sits at the heart of differences really. And if you've got good historical data on both people who received the intervention and people who didn't, then differences is a really good option to explore, because it's one of the most robust quasi-experimental designs when it's done well.
Thanks, Luke. I have another question here about running would running interventions require ethical approval for using institutional data to assess impacts? And Luke and I had agreed that I would answer any questions on ethical approval beforehand. If you are manipulating the whether or not a student receives an intervention, usually through a randomized control trial, the chances are you would need some form of ethical approval. Even if you're not, but if you are publishing the results of this evaluation, which the OFS are now asking for those results to be published if they're part of an APP, then ethical approval should be sought. There'll be varying approaches in different institutions. Sometimes a full approval process will be required, and some institutions will, the chair of their ethics board may look at the proposal and decide at the risk of the proposal and either suggest whether a full proposal needs to be made or suggest that it's perfectly okay. But it will be often on an institution by institution basis as exactly what ethical approval process will be required.
It's worth saying as well, I think, that we do cover the cover ethics as part of the data infrastructure guide. I didn't really touch on it much today just due to the time constraints, but we do have a section in there on ethics and some suggestions around using ethics for the use of institutional data. So there is some stuff in there that speaks to ethical considerations.
Thank you. We've had a question here from Drew Meller. We quite often bump up against motivation being a confounding variable. Do you have any guidance on dealing with this, particularly in QEDs?
Excuse me. Yeah, so I suppose the guidance on dealing with it is kind of that's why we use QEDs in a way, in the sense that QEDs are designed to eliminate your observed confounding variables and your unobserved confounding variables. So compared to something like propensity score matching, through its design, it deals with confounding variables that you can observe. So propensity score matching will deal with things like where demographics are confounding, like gender, ethnicity, prior attainment, that sort of thing. But the beauty of other QEDs like difference and differences and regression discontinuity design is that they help you to deal with those unobservable confounders. So how they do so varies method by method, but ultimately what it comes down to is the methods help you to create a comparison group and an intervention group where you've sort of mimicked the process of randomization through clever statistical techniques. The technique depends on the method. But what you do through using QEDs is you make sure your comparator group and your intervention group are balanced on your observable confounders, but also your unobservable confounders like motivation. So they don't deal kind of directly with motivation as an unobservable, but what they do is they deal with all unobservable confounders if they're done correctly. So not only will your QEDs deal with motivation as an unseen confounder, but it'll also deal with any other unobservable confounders as well. So that's the beauty of QEDs, really, like difference and difference and regression discontinuity design.
Thanks, Luke. Well, we've come to the end of the session, and so I'm afraid any more questions we've run out of time to answer. I will try and get back to the one question that hasn't been answered in the session, but Other than that, just like to say thanks again to Luke for his presentation of the Data Infrastructure Guide, and please do get in touch with us if you've got any feedback about the guide itself, and any suggestions for future development of it.
Thanks, everyone.